Hello, and welcome to this second recording in the History of Argumentation series. What we'll talk about in this recording will be more modern forms of argumentation. If you cast your mind back, what we spoke about in the first recording was around about classical argumentation. We spoke about how ancient Greek philosophers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle had built their lines of argumentation, or had suggested how people should build lines of argumentation. The fundamental building block of their argumentative world was the syllogism. And this is a form of argumentation that uses universal truths, universal affirmatives, and particular affirmatives to come to a conclusion. So you remember the example that we spoke about last week was, all humans are mortal, if you believe that is universally true in all cases whatsoever. And if you believe that I, Andrew, am a human, then you must believe that I am mortal. There's no way to object to that, if you believe that premise 1 and premise 2 are true in all cases whatsoever. We spoke then about the ways in which Aristotle took this further with his key structures, his key building blocks of argumentation. And we spoke about taking readers through, or taking listeners through, this introduction, the context, claims, the proofs, both positive and negative, that leads us to a conclusion. This was the classical structure of argumentation. This was one of the fundamental building blocks of the way in which Western thinkers have looked to build and construct their lines of argument. These classical structures were used throughout much of Europe's history to develop political thinkers, political discussions, and political debates. By the 20th century, however, we had swapped the way in which we look at some of this. A British 20th century philosopher called Toolman argued that this approach to argumentation, which is known as absolutism, the absolute truth, lacked practical value. Instead, Toolman wanted to develop a different type of argument. He called it practical argumentation. So, in contrast to the absolutists' theoretical argumentation, Toolman's idea of this more practical form of argumentation identified key justifications in arguments. What he wanted to do was focus on the process of building justifications, the process of building arguments that can be deployed in such a way as to focus the reader or focus the listener's mind, or persuade the listener or persuade the reader. Recognizing that in most cases, most arguments do not have universal truth, Toolman's argument is that in order to arrive at a clear conclusion, we have to go through the process of convincing our listener or convincing our reader. So Toolman believed that for a good argument to succeed, it had to provide a clear justification for the claim that is being made. So in his work, in his 1958 book, The Uses of Argument, he put forward this idea of practical argumentation. He put forward this idea of a model of argumentation that could be used where we do not have universal truth. So what was Toolman's central argument? Well, Toolman believed that the focus was less on the process of arriving at a claim because of pre-established criteria, and more about looking to explore and test our ideas through justifications. So instead of thinking about the process of having a claim and then trying to build up information, trying to build up ideas to support or defend that claim, or believing that that claim is true in all cases whatsoever, Toolman said, well, we should explore or test our ideas, explore or test our understandings through the justifications that we use in order to be able to try and show that they are true, they are accurate, or they are correct. And he believed then that this real-world argument became more practical. So these were arguments without clear truths. These are arguments without obvious answers. And importantly, these are arguments without claims of universalism. So without claims of something being true in all cases whatsoever. So Toolman's central argument then is that these real-world arguments require clear justifications and clear groundings in order to be able to convince a reader, in order to be able to convince a listener. So the way in which he suggested that then was to go through a number of different components. And you'll see that actually some of these are quite similar to what Aristotle had been talking about. The way in which Toolman phrases this or structures this, however, is just slightly different. So we'll go through the building blocks and then we'll look at an example. So Toolman says that your claim is your conclusion. It is the thing that you want to convince your readers, your listeners of being true or of being the case. How you do that then is by laying out grounds. That's your evidence, that's your data. That's the things that tell us this is the case. The next step after that is what's called a warrant. And this is your justification of the connection between that evidence, between those grounds, and that claim or those conclusions. So your warrant is your place where you show us the way in which the evidence you have gathered, the way in which the data you have connects to the claim and makes the claim obviously true. What you then have after that is backing. And this is your justification for the ways in which that evidence is true and how we know that's the case. So the way in which you test the strength of that evidence, the way in which you show your reader or you explain to your listener the way in which the data you have is solid, is checkable, is verifiable. And your backing is your way of then showing us the ways in which that warrant connects your evidence to your conclusion. But then there's a problem. If we're not dealing with universal truths, then you will have a rebuttal. This is the place where an opposer may come in and say, but actually, no, you're wrong because of set of circumstances 1, 2, or 3. Or there's this alternative, or there's this limitation, or there's this complication. So the rebuttal is the process through which that core claim you're making is challenged. So Toolman then says, okay, well, we can respond to that. We have a qualifier. And a qualifier is you saying, my claim is this. My claim is this, not in all cases whatsoever, because of the rebuttal, or the alternative or the limitation, but it is your attempt to avoid any claims of universalism. So to avoid any claims of something being true in all cases whatsoever. So this model then, this claim, because of grounds, with the explanation of a warrant that is then provided with backing, which then recognises that there is a rebuttal and so deploys a qualifier, is Toolman's argumentation structure. When Toolman first developed it, he was thinking about legal argumentation. So he's thinking about the arguments between lawyers and the use that might deploy in a courtroom. However, over time, this model of argumentation has been picked up by mainstream people thinking about rhetoric and the deployment of argument. Toolman's argumentation structure here, though, became really, really famous and really well known. And let's look at Toolman's example. So in order to example this, let's go to the beautiful white sands of Bermuda. So Bermuda is a small British island in the North Atlantic Ocean, just off the coast of the United States. Why we're using this example is it shows us the way in which universal truths can be challenged. Okay, so let's think then. We're thinking about Bermuda. The claim I want to make is that Harry is a British citizen. So this example comes from Toolman's book, From the Uses of Argument in 1958. So the core claim that I want to show is true and want to prove is that Harry is a British citizen. So then I've got, well, how do I know that? How do I prove that? Well, I can say I have grounds for that. Harry was born in Bermuda. So here is my proof. Here are the grounds. Here's the data that I have. I know that Harry was born in Bermuda. But then I have to say, well, how does that work? Why does that matter? Why does Harry being born in Bermuda mean that Harry is a British citizen? Well, then I have my warrant. I can then say a person born in Bermuda is legally recognised as a British citizen. So then I'm saying, okay, I have my claim, Harry is a British citizen. I then have my grounds to prove that, to say that Harry was born in Bermuda. And then I'm doing the explanation to the reader to say, okay, we have to acknowledge that I have the data, I have the evidence of Harry being born in Bermuda, and then I have a warrant, which is my way of explaining the ways in which I know that that then impacts on Harry's citizenship. So I then can say a person born in Bermuda is a legally recognised British citizen. And then I have to have backing. So then I have to say, and here is how we know this is true. So my first piece of evidence here is Harry being born in Bermuda. I then have my warrant to explain that, and I then have my backing, which shows us the ways in which we know that to be the case. Well, we can say that legal statutes show that a person born in Bermuda is a British citizen. So we can then prove that that's the case. However, because we don't deal in universal truths, we then have a rebuttal. If Harry's parents were not British, or if Harry decided to become an American instead, then he would no longer be a British citizen. So Harry may not be British if his parents are not British themselves, or if Harry adopted American citizenship. So then we have to have a qualifier. We can say then, okay, well, Harry is presumably a British citizen. So then what we have here is, instead of having universal truths, Harry is a British citizen in all cases whatsoever, that is not necessarily true. He may not be British in all cases whatsoever. And we're recognising the rebuttal here to say that Harry is presumably a British citizen, and the reason why he's presumably a British citizen is because he was born in Bermuda, is because a person that's born in Bermuda is a legally recognised British citizen, and we have the legal statutes, the laws that show us that's the case. So what we can then say is, well, Harry is presumably a British citizen. And we can say that Harry is presumably a British citizen because he was born in Bermuda. And we know that to be the case because of the legal backing, and unless his parents are not British, or unless he adopted American citizenship, for example, then our argument holds. So this is the way of thinking about building these clearer lines of argumentation when we are not dealing with universal truth. So let's look again at how that works. So we have our claim, we have grounds, which is our evidence or our data. We have a warrant, which is our justification of why that evidence connects to the claim. We have our backing, which is our way of proving that that's true. We have our rebuttal, which is our recognition of alternatives or a recognition of complications or limitations. And we have our qualifier, which is our addition of particular words or phrases to challenge any claims of universalism. So this then became Toolman's model of argumentation. And what Toolman tried to do was argue against universalism. He tried to argue against things being true in all cases whatsoever. He tried to argue for these more nuanced forms of argument. Toolman believed that conceptual change, that the ability to change somebody's mind, was an evolutionary process. So the ability for a person or a group of people to change their mind, to be persuaded of a thing, was an evolutionary process. He argued that innovation occurs, so innovation in mindsets, innovation and understanding of concepts and ideas, when the professionals of a particular discipline, for example, come to view things in a way that is different from their predecessors. And that is an evolution of ideas. And this is because multiple concepts can be true, multiple concepts can be valid in different contexts. If you think of universalism, then that says that things are either true or they are not true. Things are either 1 or 0. It's a very binary approach. Toolman argues that context matters. So they become what's called a relativist. And that relativist perspective is that the context is what matters here. One context is neither better nor worse than another. One concept is neither better nor worse than another. It's the evaluation depending on those justifications and that process of comparison which determines the strength of an argument. So when we think about more modern forms of argumentation, we're thinking about these claims, these grounds, and those justifications for why it's the case. So that's more modern forms of argumentation based on Stephen Toolman. When we're looking at papers, when we're looking at our primary sources, keep in mind that some of our writers, some of our authors, some of our speakers will not have had access to Toolman's line of thinking. He wrote in 1958. Works from before 1958 would not have had access to Toolman's line of thinking. Instead, think about the more classical forms of structure, the classical forms of argumentation. But when you're thinking about your own writing, when you're thinking about your own analysis of texts and sources, try and look at Toolman's model of argumentation.